I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. In today's video, I've got tips for you. 65 quick tips, little things that you, well, let's be honest, you're going to already know about some of them. But some of them, hopefully a lot of them, you didn't already know. And we're just going to go right through this video, listing off all of these quick tips. Some of these tips, maybe a little more detail might be needed. And so down in the video description, for any of the tips where there might be another video that go in a little more depth, that's where that's going to be. So let's get into the tips. Tip number 1. If you have Fat Shark goggles, this joystick right here is a brightness and contrast control that lets you make, well, just play with it and you'll see. Push it left and right for brightness and up and down for contrast, or maybe the other way around. This can make a really significant difference in how much detail you can see based on what the video signal the camera is sending to your goggles. If like your shadows are all super dark and you think your camera's messed up, you can just tweak that right before you fly by adjusting brightness and contrast. A lot of people don't know that this is here. It makes a big difference. Tip number 2. If the module on your Fat Shark goggles will not turn on, do you need to send them off for service? Maybe not. There's a switch on the underside here, which is an on-off switch for the module. It's used to turn the module off when you're using like the internal DVR, because the signals will interfere. And if this switch gets bumped to the 0 position, your module will not turn on. Many people think their module is broken or their goggles are broken, and they just actually didn't realize they bumped that switch. Tip number 3. If you're trying to use a microphone with your Fat Shark goggles, like, you know, when you like Mr. Steele, you want to have an earbud in, then you need to plug the microphone in to this port on the underside of your goggles. This port here on the side of your goggles is for an AV output, and if you plug your mic in here, it won't work right. Tip number 4, always record DVR in your goggles when you're flying. The time when you crash your quad and can't remember where it crashed, the DVR review will save you. And Fat Shark goggles, at least, there we go again with the Fat Sharks, they have an auto record function that many people don't know exists that will just automatically start recording the minute you plug the goggles in. In order to do that, we're going to turn off the module using the switch that we talked about in the previous tip, and then we're going to hold down this right hand joystick to access the DVR. Then once you're in the DVR menu, you're going to go down 2 times to go to the record setting, push to the right to enter the menu, and go down to auto start continuous, and push to the right to accept the option. Then push to the left to exit the DVR menu. Now, as soon as you power up the goggles, if there's an SD card inserted, the Fat Shark goggles will begin recording. And you want to double check this because sometimes it doesn't auto start, but it's much better than nothing. If your FPV goggles have lenses, like, well, these are Fat Sharks, Enway Commander, Sky Zone, all of them are the same. If they have lenses like this and the sun shines into them, it will burn the screens. You'll get these white spots on the screen, and that is impossible to repair. You just have to replace the screens. When you set your goggles down, always set them down facing downwards. If you wear them on your head, it's pretty safe because the sun can't get in. If you wear them hanging around your neck, I do know people who've had their goggles burn from them hanging around their neck. Whenever you set your goggles down, don't just set them down anywhere where the sun could get in them. It can burn the screens and damage them. And no, that's not covered under warranty. Whatever FPV module you have, don't trust the auto scan function. There we'll go to, this is rapid fire. We'll do a band scan. It's going to scan to try and find anybody who's transmitting. Especially when the transmitter is very close to you, the signal is so strong that precisely identifying what channel it's on is impossible. So when you use band scan, it will, one of those channels is the channel that the guy is on, but a lot of beginners trust band scan, and when they band scan and they get, you know, Race Band 1 or Fat Shark 3 or whatever, they think that must be the right channel. Then they go fly and they get bad range. Don't trust the band scan function to guarantee you that you're on the right channel. Always set the channel manually based on what you know the device is on. Unless you're spectating, then use band scan because who cares? Tip number 6. If you're using one of the video receivers that does sync reconstruction, frame combining, like Rapid View and Clear View, then you will often get very, very, very good results with 2 Omni antennas on the goggles. It's a little bit simpler and more consistent coverage than having an Omni and a patch. If you're using a traditional diversity module, in my experience, in most cases, you'll do better with an Omni and a patch, but you can certainly give it a try. Tip number 8, if you have a FreeSky RXSR, there is an S-Bus out and an S-Bus in pin. The S-Bus out That's the one that you want to connect to your flight controller. The S-Bus in is used if you have two receivers on the quad. You might want to have like redundant receivers. You could feed the S-Bus out of one into the S-Bus in of the other, and then the S-Bus out of that one into the flight controller. Most of us aren't doing that. Ignore S-Bus in. A lot of people make that mistake. Tip number 9. If you are trying to get RSSI working and your RSSI channel keeps resetting, every time you hit save, it just goes back to disabled, the fix is to go to configuration and make sure that you have disabled RSSI ADC. If RSSI ADC is on, then the RSSI aux channel doesn't work, and you just got to disable that. Tip number 10, in the ports tab of Betaflight, never, ever, ever disable the MSP option on this line, the USB VCP. The only thing that USB VCP is used for is this MSP function. If you disable this and save, you will no longer be able to connect to your flight controller using the configurator, so don't do that. In fact, why do they even let you do that? They shouldn't even let you do that. Tip number 11, if you do disable MSP and then you cannot connect to your flight controller anymore, the answer is to put it into DFU, bootloader mode. Do that by holding down the bootloader button on your flight controller, and then while holding it down, plug in USB. You should see DFU up here, and then go to the firmware flasher and re-flash your firmware with the full chip erase option selected. You're going to need to select the correct target here, and if you don't know what your target is, then you're going to need to figure it out. So hopefully you know what your target is. But reflash it with full chip erase, and that will wipe your configuration, but it will also restore your ability to connect to the flight controller. Tip number 12. In order to find out what target your flight controller uses, go to the command line and type version. And the information you need is right here, Kakute F7. Then, if you ever need to flash your board, that is what you'll select from this pull-down menu right here. Kakute F7. That's what you need to flash to your board. Once you have screwed up your configuration and you can't get into your board anymore, it's too late. So go do that right now and make a note of what the correct target is for your board, so you'll know in the future. Tip number 13. Isn't it annoying when you plug in USB and your beeper starts going beep, 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 beep all over the place? Here's how you fix that. In the configuration tab, you go down to the beeper configuration and you turn off the USB option right here. Turn that off. Then whenever you're plugged into USB and don't have your battery plugged in, the beeper will not work. Side note, this doesn't 100% work on all flight controllers. Some of them can't tell that they're on USB, but if you turn this off, most of the time your flight controller will not beep the beeper when you're plugged into USB and your battery's disconnected. Tip number 14. Can't tell you how often people come to me and ask me if I can give them the default configuration for some quadcopter, that they've lost their configuration, they wiped it, they lost your flight controller, whatever. The very first thing you should do when you get a new quadcopter, when you get a new bind and fly, or if you just finished a new build and it's ready to fly, you go diff all here in the command line. And then you hit save to file, and you save that info out to a text file, save it on your Dropbox, save it on your OneDrive, save it in your email, somewhere where you'll be able to find it again. And then later on, you will know the exact configuration of your quadcopter if you ever have to replace your flight controller or flash it, upgrade it, anything like that. Tip number 15. If you have a Tyrannus radio like an X9D or a QX7 and you're having problems like your audio files aren't playing or your Lua scripts aren't running or it won't boot up, a lot of times it means the SD card that came with it has taken a dump. The SD card that comes with the QX7 and the X9D is really poor quality, and I would just throw it out the day you get it and replace it with a good one. FreeSky has solved this problem on their newer radios by not shipping them with an SD card at all. So, tip number 16. When you get a new radio, whatever radio it is, one of the first things you should do is run the analog stick calibration. This is sometimes done from the factory, but you should never count on that. And the exact way you do that will be different for different radios, but what you're going to do is run the calibration routine. You'll start by centering the sticks, and then you'll move the sticks to the extent of their motion, and it'll help make sure that it knows the stick travel. Tip number 17, when you do the analog stick calibration, be very gentle as you push the sticks to the top and bottom of their travel. Don't push, like, be just the barest touch. And the reason for that is if you push harder, then that's how hard you'll have to push to get the full stick travel going forward. You're always going to push harder in real life than when you're here on the bench. Be as gentle as possible, and that will ensure that you get full stick travel when you are actually flying. And you also do the same thing with the pot. Don't just go super hard. Be very gentle. Tip number 18. When you set up your Crossfire system to put RSSI in your OSD, don't use RSSI. Use LQ, link quality. I've got a video showing how to set up Crossfire LQ and RSSI, and I'll put a link to that down in the video description. The short version is that RSSI is the raw signal strength, LQ is the quality of the signal, and you can have a strong signal that also has a lot of noise and is being interfered with. So basically, for most pilots, LQ is going to be a better indicator of when you're about to fail-safe than RSSI. Tip number 19. TBS Crossfire does a pretty freaking good job of managing firmware updates. It's pretty hard to screw up your Crossfire receiver by messing up a firmware update. But if you do find yourself in a situation where for some reason you can't bind and the firmware update isn't happening, there is an emergency update procedure. This has saved me every single time that I've gotten myself in trouble with a firmware update. The way to do it is in this URL, and this URL is down in the video description, or you can just read it here if you like. Tip number 20. When you get a new set of motors and you cut the motor wires off, save those. It's perfectly good silicone wire. You'll pay for this later. You pay for this somewhere else. Just save. Like, eventually you'll get so much you'll start throwing it out, but save them. Tip 21. When you have dead battery packs, cut the balance connectors off. Again, that's perfectly good silicone wire, and sometimes you'll need to replace a broken balance connector. You'll have the housing. You can just pull these wires out by lifting the retention tabs, and you're good to go. Tip 22. If the SMA connector of your video antenna is in electrical contact with the frame, so in this case we have a metal mounting bracket that's touching the frame, the carbon of the frame, that can sometimes, not always, but sometimes cause video noise. If you have crazy video noise that you can't figure out how to solve it, try isolating the antenna connector from the frame. Sometimes that fixes it. Tip 23. In the Betaflight OSD tab, you absolutely must have the warnings OSD element turned on. And in fact, in Betaflight 4.0, they made it on by default, so you're good to go. If you're flying an earlier version of Betaflight, or if for some reason you turned this off, go back, turn it on. It's so useful. Anytime your quadcopter has a problem like a failsafe or a runaway Tasmanian devil flip out or other issues, the warnings OSD element will show a warning that will be useful to people like me who are trying to troubleshoot your issue. Turn this on, leave it on. However, over here you can decide what warnings you actually need to see. You'll notice I've turned a few of these off. Like, I don't want a warning when my battery's not full, and I'm watching my battery voltage, so I don't need one for that. But you definitely want arming disabled, visual beeper. I don't even know what that is, but okay, I want that warning. These other ones, sometimes I turn those off. Tip number 24. Some people like to run their props reversed. They like to run props out instead of props in, which is the direction you see here, which is the Betaflight default. In fact, I've got a video talking about the advantages and disadvantages of props in versus props out. It's linked down in the video description. If you check this box here, this tip is that this does not actually reverse your motors. It simply tells Betaflight that you have reversed your motors. You still need to go into your ESCs and make the motors spin this direction. If you simply check this box and don't change your motor directions with your ESCs, then the quad will flip out when it tries to fly. So, tip number 25. Use two-switch arming for safety. Betaflight has a thing called the Prearm mode, which you can use to force yourself to flip not just one but two switches in order to get the quad to arm. This is really great because it is super easy for you to accidentally flip an arming switch and cause the quad to arm while you're like holding it in your hands or when you didn't expect it. I've got a video on how to set up the Prearm mode, and I'll link it down in the video description. You'll notice that I didn't have the Prearm mode set up, and that's because I have two-switch arming set up in my transmitter. I've also got a video on how to set up two-switch arming in your transmitter. It's linked down in the video description. Tip 26. The next few tips relate to loss of video. If you lose video and the video goes to static, it means your video transmitter has turned off or moved to another channel. It might also mean your video transmitter went into pit mode, but that's a little more rare. Tip 27, if you lose video and the screen goes black, but you can still see the OSD, that means that the camera has come disconnected, but the flight controller is still connected to the VTX because the flight controller is generating the OSD. Tip number 28. If the quad falls out of the sky and it stays mostly flat and just kind of goes, that's probably a fail-safe or a loss of power. Tip 29. If the quad falls out of the sky and death rolls, like spins into the ground, that is probably an issue with a motor or ESC. Or maybe a prop exploded or a prop was loose, but one of the motors stopped making thrust. The one that you need to troubleshoot is the one that went down first. So if you study the DVR and look at the direction of the roll, the one that went down when it rolled, that's the one that stopped making thrust. Speaking of fail-safes, tip number 30. If you're having fail-safes with your quad, then if it's happening with all your quads, the problem is probably your transmitter. If it's happening with just one of your quads and not any of the others, the problem is probably the receiver or the antennas on the quad. Tip 31. Never power your VTX with the antenna removed. The VTX is a relatively powerful transmitter of RF energy, and if it tries to transmit RF energy and there's no antenna there to sort of distribute it, then it will burn itself out. You'll basically get low range. And that's true if you have an MMCX connector, it needs to be plugged in, or if you have an SMA connector, the antenna needs to be connected. Some VTXs are a little bit resilient. Some VTXs will burn out after just 3 seconds power with no. So that's one of the things you get when you buy a more expensive VTX. Tip 32, it is, however, safe to plug in your goggles with no antennas connected, because the goggles are a receive-only device. They're not transmitting energy, and so if you have the antennas off, they just won't get very good reception, but they won't damage themselves. Tip 33, if you've got a rapid-fire module and in the OSD it keeps showing just one RSSI bar, or it starts and it's showing 2 and then all of a sudden it switches to showing only 1, chances are you need to do the inductor mod. It is going into low power mode, and you need to mod the L1 and the L10 inductors. I've got a video about how to do the L1 mod, but not the L10 mod. Oops, but that's what you need to do. Tip number 34 has to do with flight line etiquette. When you are setting up a flight line, whether this is an official race or whether it's just a bunch of friends sitting around flying freestyle or in somebody's backyard, always designate an official landing and takeoff area that is at least, like, let's say 25 or 30 feet, more is better, away from the flight area. And never power up, never be powered up anywhere except that area. Here's why. If you are powered up and you are close to a pilot who's flying, even if you're on a different channel, you can interfere with them. Do this next time you're flying. Well, take your quadcopter, fly it out into the field, land it, have one of your buddies on a different channel hold his quadcopter close to your head. You will see your video break up, even if he's on a different channel. So the best thing to do is to never power up near the flight line. I know people do this and they get away with it a lot of the time, but the small percent of the time when you knock somebody out of the air, it sucks. So form good habits. Designate, just put a cone over there, 30 feet away, 50 feet away, and say, nobody powers up except in that area. You walk over there, you plug in, you set it down, you come back, you fly away. You land over there, you walk over there, you pick it up, you unplug it, and you come back to the flight line. I know we don't fly FPV because we like walking around. You want to come in and land right next to your feet and just bend over and pick it up. And that's fine, except when that knocks the guy next to you out of the air. And that's bad. Tip number 35, not all 5-volt outputs are equivalent. If you look at some flight controllers like, well, let's start with mine. This 3.3/5-volt pad right here is different from, for example, the Buzz Plus pad or the 5-volt pad on the underside of the board. And the difference is that this pad will be powered when you plug into USB. This is important because it lets you plug in USB and your receiver will power up, so you can test your receiver channels. You can set up your aux modes without ever having to plug in a battery on the bench, and that's very nice. But you would not want to plug in like a 5-volt video transmitter to this same pad, because you wouldn't want that powered up when you plug in USB. You would only want your receiver plugged into this pad. So if your flight controller has a specific 5-volt pad designated for the receiver, that may be powered from USB, and you only want to put your receiver on that pad. On some flight controllers, the 5-volt pad for the receiver will be no different than any other. It will not power up from USB. You will need to, unfortunately, plug your battery in order to set up your receiver, but it does mean that you could then run anything you want off that 5-volt pad, not just the receiver. Tip 36. You do not need to make a brand new model in your radio for every single quadcopter that you own. In fact, you can bind multiple receivers to the same model, and as long as you don't have more than one of them powered on at a time, you're fine. And this saves you a lot of work. You can see in my Tyrannus that I have one model for each receiver type that I use. So there's one for D16 receivers, one for D8, one for Crossfire, one for R9, and that saves a lot of work. I've got a whole video about this. Again, there's a list down in the video description to more details. Tip 37. FrSky has a model match function which prevents the wrong receiver from binding to the wrong model on the radio. But if you're using an external module like Crossfire, the model match function doesn't work. The Crossfire module has no way of knowing which model is loaded in the Tyrannus, so it has no way of knowing which receiver. Basically, any Crossfire receiver will bind to any model that you have selected on the radio. So just set all your Crossfire rigs up identical and just make double sure that you haven't loaded the wrong model by accident. One really nice thing about Crossfire, tip 38, is it's very easy to switch all your Crossfire binds to a different radio simply by taking the model out of your radio and putting it in somebody else's radio. And now, as long as you have to copy the model over, but you can, if you have multiple radios, you can very easily switch your Crossfire quads from one to the other without having to do any rebinding. Tip number 39. When you are flashing a receiver using this plug on the bottom of your, well, this one is an X9 Lite. The X Lite has the same thing. The QX7 has the same thing. When you're using this plug on the bottom of your transmitter to flash a receiver, you want to select the Flash S-Port option. That is how the radio knows to flash to that plug on the bottom. You definitely do not want to flash internal module, external module. That is not what you want. Tip number 40. When you're in the Betaflight OSD and you've made some changes, and you want to save and exit quickly, you don't have to back all the way out to the main menu. Just yaw right, and you'll be presented with a quick menu to exit, save and exit, or save and reboot. Tip number 41, in the Betaflight OSD menu, yaw left just quickly backs you out one step. You don't have to go all the way to the bottom and do back. Tip number 42, when you bend a prop and you're going to bend it back, how do you know where to bend it back to? Here's how. Look at your prop side on, and just rotate one and make sure that they're all in line with each other, and then rotate the other and make sure they're all in line with each other. And you can do that looking at it any which way. And if any of them, oh, see, like that one, and just, no. Well, there you go. Yeah, now that's how to get them kind of back balanced correctly. Thanks to Drew Camden for that. He's the one who showed me that tip. Tip 43, if when you go to 0 throttle, the quad kind of drops an arm. You go to 0 throttle and the quad's fine, and then as you go to 0 throttle, whoop, it just kind of drops an arm. Turn air mode on. That's the fix for that. Tip 44, protect your balance lead from getting chopped up. There's a whole bunch of ways to do this. This is the way that I personally prefer. Just take a rubber band. It's so simple. Take a rubber band and just hold it just like that. That's how I like to do it. There's a million other ways to do it, but that's the one that kind of works the best for me. Tip number 45. If you're searching for pads to remap something to, the Cam-C pad on some flight controllers will work. This pad is intended for analog camera control, but many people aren't using analog camera control. And it's a general purpose I/O pin that can easily be remapped to something like soft serial if you're going to try to do smart audio. The catch here is that it's only usable for low baud rate communication because there is a resistor on this pin, and it's necessary to make the Cam-C function work, but it messes up high baud rate function. So I don't think this will work for something like SmartPort, But for a low baud rate, like for example, smart audio, the CAM-C pad might work and is worth a try if for some reason the LED strip pad is already used or you lifted that one. You can always try CAM-C as a backup, but only for slow stuff. Don't try to use it for a motor output or a high baud rate thing like SmartPort. Tip number 46. If you are trying to remap your resources, like you've lifted a motor output and you need to remap it somewhere else, or for any other reason you're remapping some resource, the very first resource that you should try to use to remap to is the LED strip resource, the LED pad on your flight controller. The reason for this is that the LED pad always has its own timer and DMA channel, and that means that it's guaranteed the LED strip pad will not conflict with anything else. Sometimes when you try to remap a motor or soft serial to somewhere else, it doesn't work, and that's because of a DMA conflict or anyway, LED strip will always work as a destination for remapping something to. Tip number 47, when you're remapping and you're trying to remap the LED pad, you need to know that LED_strip is the resource you want to use. It's a very common mistake for people to use the LED resource, which makes sense because that's usually what the actual pad is labeled as on the flight controller. The LED resource is actually the status LED that blinks when you first power up. And if you remap that one, the status LED will stop working, but you won't actually be remapping the LED strip pad like you probably are expecting to. So leave LED alone, use LED strip. That's what you want. Tip number 48. When you go into the OSD menu to adjust the settings on your video transmitter, the output power and channels that you see in the menu may not match what your video transmitter does. For example, if we look here, we can see an output power of 25, 100, 200, 400, 600 milliwatts. But your video transmitter, maybe it does 25, 200, 500, 1,000. The video transmitters can report their actual capabilities to the flight controller, but the flight controller doesn't actually pay attention to that, and it just uses these fixed values. So generally what will happen is 25 milliwatts will be the lowest output power the video transmitter supports. 100 milliwatts, 200 milliwatts, it'll just work its way on up. It's the same thing with smart audio. The actual numbers are different, but basically there's just power level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the video transmitter decides what its output power is going to be based on whatever logic it wants. Tip number 49, always use some kind of strain relief on your main battery lead. So you see right here, the battery lead is just soldered to the ESC. The battery will eject someday. It'll tug on this and eventually it'll just rip it right off and we'll have to replace the ESC. Always use some kind of strain relief. Like for example, we could take a zip tie and just zip tie this to the arm and then pass it back around. Depending exactly how you do the strain relief will vary depending on where your battery is and what frame you've got, but always have some kind of strain relief to prevent an ejected battery from tugging directly on the power pads on the ESC. And by the way, don't direct solder your XT60 to the ESC or PDB. Always use a short length of cable to give some strain relief. It'll just rip it off and destroy it. Tip number 50. If your screen looks like this, there's an easy fix. You need to go into the OSD tab, go into the font manager, and re-upload the font. You need to have your... Oh, I've done it. You need to have your battery plugged in or this won't work, though. There is a video about this that goes through the steps. It's linked down in the video description. If you see interference in your FPV feed that looks like this, basically thin white horizontal lines that sort of dance around, most of the time that is going to be Wi-Fi interfering with you. Yep, 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi overlaps with some of the frequencies that FPV pilots use. The fix for this is to either move the Wi-Fi to a different channel. If it's your Wi-Fi network, move it to channel 124 or lower. Any channel with a number lower than 124 will get it off of the FPV frequencies. Alternatively, you can move your FPV up to a channel that Wi-Fi isn't capable of using. Race 6, 7, and 8 are all higher frequencies than Wi-Fi is capable of using. And even if you're in a very congested urban area with lots of Wi-Fi, race 6, 7, and 8 will always be free of Wi-Fi. Tip number 52. Before each flight, clean your lens. Nothing worse than ruining the best flight you ever had with a piece of dirt on your lens. Tip 53. By default, Betaflight will not let you arm if your quadcopter is not level. This is not what most of us want. So go into the configuration tab and set your max arm angle to 180. That will allow it to arm even if it's completely upside down. Tip number 54. What if you didn't set the max arm angle to 180 and now your quad is stuck in a tree, and since it's not right side up, you can't arm it to try to shake it out of the tree? Here's the workaround. What you want to do is you want to use the stick commands, and these are left over from clean flight, but they're still there, and the stick command you want is calibrate accelerometer. To do that, you're going to push the left stick up and to the left and the right stick down, and that will recalibrate the accelerometer so the quadcopter thinks it's level even if it's upside down in a tree. You can then arm the quad and try and shake it out, and then when you land, when you get it back down again, put it back level and recalibrate it again so that otherwise you won't be able to take off again. Speaking of being stuck in a tree, tip number 55. If you do not have flip crash mode enabled, also known as turtle mode, you need it enabled. Now, if you don't see flip crash mode here, it's because you're not using D-Shot. If your ESCs don't support D-Shot, then you won't be able to do this. If your ESCs do support D-Shot, then you should be using D-Shot. You want flip crash mode enabled. Even if you never use it to flip over on the ground, it is super, super useful for helping you get out of trees. Tip number 56. Turn off the OSD on your freaking camera if you're not using it. I was at the International Open. World Championship racing pilots were freaking flying with run cam 5 volts in their screen. Did you not know how to do it? That's what this tip is for you. Here's what you do. You plug your joystick into your camera and you press up for 2 seconds to get to the super duper secret OSD menu. And then you go and you freaking turn off all that nonsense. You freaking turn it off. Yeah, it's still there. 5 volts is still there. Why is it still there? I don't know. Oh, I forgot to turn it off. Okay. Oh, you turn off all that nonsense. That's how you do it. Hold up on the joystick. Tip number 57. If your radio came from the factory with a ratchet on the throttle, mine doesn't have a ratchet, turn it off. Get rid of that ratchet. The exact way to do it will vary depending on your radio. Usually you got to open up the radio though and turn a screw on the inside. Look in the list in the video description for an instruction about how to disable the ratchet on your radio. If you fly planes, you might want a ratchet. If you fly multi-rotors, you want a smooth throttle. No clicky clicks. For FreeSky radios, when you bind, you have the option to choose the channel range. And you can choose channel 1 through 8, or you can choose channels 1 through 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, up to 16. More channels is nice, but notice that when I went to channels not 1 through 9, this number went from 18 milliseconds from 9 milliseconds. That's right. If you set this channel 1 to 8, you get lower latency, and that's better. Basically, if you're interested in high performance, always set this to 1 through 8. You got to give up 8 channels to do it, but it's lower latency, and that's a good thing. The next couple tips are about battery voltage. Very common for people to wonder what the best voltage is to stop flying at. Batteries are irreparably damaged anytime you go below 3.0 volts per cell. However, when you're flying and the battery is being heavily loaded by the motors, you usually will see some, you're at risk anytime you go below, let's say, about 3.3 volts per cell. And frankly, anytime you're below about 3.5 volts per cell, chances are your performance isn't going to be that great. So here's the guideline that I use. Tip 59, stop flying when you see the battery at about 3.5 volts per cell. The exception to this is if you've got a little 1S micro quad with a 250 milliamp hour 1S battery. Those things, you gotta run them down to like 3.1 volts just to get any kind of flight time out of them. But for a larger quad, then 3.5 volts per cell is about the absolute minimum I want to see most of the time when I'm flying. In general, after you let the battery rest, it will come up to about 3.8 volts per cell. And that's tip number 60. After you're done flying and the battery has had a chance to rest and recover its voltage, then you want to see it resting at about 3.7 to 3.8 volts per cell. If they're resting much lower than that, chances are you might be over discharging them and they might be going too low and taking damage. The final tip, tip number 61, is that batteries should be stored at 3.8 volts per cell. That's assuming they're LiPo batteries. If you have a LiFe chemistry battery for your transmitter, that's a different thing. But for LiPos, 3.8 volts per cell is the storage voltage, and that's true for high volt LiPos as well. 3.8 volts per cell is what you want them at for storage. Finally, tip number 62, how long should you leave them at max? Let's say you charge your batteries up and you're going to fly the next day, but then you can't make it because it's raining. Should you put them at storage? The real answer to this is that the longer batteries are at full charge, the more their capacity is slowly and slightly degraded. Leaving them at full charge for 2 months will show a significant impact. Leaving them at full voltage for 1 day is not such a big deal. But leaving them at full charge for 1 day 60 times, that's a cumulative impact and it will add up. So in my rule of thumb is I'll leave them fully charged for 1 or 2 days, and after that, if I know I'm not going to fly, I'll put them back at storage. Tip number 63. When you get a new flight controller, before you touch a soldering iron to it, plug it into USB on your computer. Just make sure that it works. Sometimes they're DOA, and by the time you solder on them, most vendors will still have your back, but it's way more convincing if you haven't even touched it with a soldering iron. Good thing to check. Just plug it in, move it around, check that the accelerometer and the gyro work. Just make sure it seems like everything is copacetic before you start soldering iron. Tip number 64, make a smoke stopper, use it. Look in the video description for a link to a video with more details about this. It's incredibly important to have one of these and to know how to use it. It will save you some heartache and smoke. Tip number 65, last but not least, if you fly anywhere where your quad might take abrasive damage, like on asphalt or concrete, you will get a lot more life out of cap head screws on motor screws and any screw on the bottom of your quad. The cap head screws have a much deeper socket for the hex driver to fit into, and it's much harder to sort of scuff them and strip them out. Whereas button head screws will very, very quickly just get scuffed away and not have anything for the driver to bite into. I always use cap head screws as my motor screws, and as the okay, sometimes I'm out of them and I use button heads. But I prefer cap heads for any screws on the underside of the quadcopter. They're a lot more durable. And that is going to do it for the list. 65 things that, hopefully at least a few of them, you didn't already know about FPV. Thank you guys so much for watching. Happy flying.